Næste indslag bliver på engelsk, men vi er meget glade. Men Christian forstår faktisk en del dansk under panelet, og I kan også godt sagtens stille spørgsmål. Christian er Ph.D. fra Islands Universitet og fra Humboldt i Berlin, og har skrevet en meget, meget interessant Ph.D.-afhandling om EF- eller EU-skepsis i både Grønland og Færøerne, men har dykket godt og grundigt ned i arkiverne, og det er på baggrund af den Ph.D., at vi har bedt Christian om at komme hele vejen faktisk fra Japan over Finland, København hertil, og skal heldigvis på ferie på Gran Canaria, som jeg har forstået det om et par dage. Men velkommen til, Christian. Jeg er meget glad for at se dig.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, Rasmus. It's great to be back here again. I have only been here once before, so this is my second time, and I also want to thank you for organizing this conference, because I think it's very important to bring both perspectives together. If you talk about EU-Greenland relations of today, you need to know the past. And I also think it's good to bring together two different backgrounds. I have not done any interview with any Greenlandic politician. So all you will hear now is the impression I had as somebody completely alien to the situation, reading thousands of newspaper articles and parliamentary documentations from the 60s until today. And at the same time, you have the people who actually worked, who know the stories behind all that. So I think this together will give us a very good impression of what the whole EU-Greenland relations were about. And I'm going to start shortly. The PhD project at Berlin and at Iceland does not only deal with this period of time, it's really from the 50s when the debate started for the first time until, I think, 2014. So you have everything in there, so if you're interested in the book, you can get it atuagataho. Yeah. Very interesting what struck me before, when we were talking before. I'm going to focus on the 70s mostly. But what is interesting is, if you look at history, why 71, 72 was such a turning point in Greenlandic politics, it's because this, what in Denmark was called support, was not actually a support. I'm not going to deal with this a lot, but what led up to the first referendum in Greenland in 72 was the landsråd was asked 3 times about whether it is okay to be included in the Danish membership application. 61 the first time, landsråd said yes. 67, the landsråd said yes. And still in December 71, there was a committee in landsråd which was consulted by the Danish government with the terms and conditions of the accession treaty. And they said, yes, this is a good negotiation result. And then you have what happens in September 72, only a few months later, you have a clear rejection in the landsråd and in the referendum by the Greenlandic electorate, nearly with the same margins. And what is interesting is, because coming back to this support, I put it in brackets, landsråd, I think, did not consider themselves to have to be a political decision-making body. It was consulting the Danish government on the peculiar conditions in Greenland, but it did not consider itself a political body. So what happens in 72 is a politicization of Greenland. And the thing is, we have to take a political position, and we have the right to do so. It's not just something, then we follow Denmark and we just tell them, well, you should take into account our fishing limit. So this is why I think also, and I want to agree with Rasmus, it was such an important year, 72, for Greenlandic society and politics. But I'm going to deal mainly with the rejection part. The basic story you all know, the 2 referendums. In between, Greenland got home rule, which made the second referendum possible. In between were the party foundations of Siumut and Atasut, also based around the objection or not objection to EU membership. But I'm going to go into this later. And what I want to do in the beginning is put up a question. I mean, was it a lost cause from the start? How could this ever have worked? I mean, this is what you could think when you look at Greenland-EU relations, because of 2 aspects. On the one hand, you had the EC Common Fisheries Policy, decided exactly in the same year, 1 week before the accession negotiations were started with Denmark, Ireland, the UK and Norway. And the Common Fisheries Policy foresaw that the EU member states would share their community seas, and the administration and the division of quota would happen in Brussels and not in the States anymore. For them it was a good idea maybe because Germany only has a small coastline, so the same for the Netherlands, they have to go somewhere else to fish. So for them it made a lot of sense to do this before the accession negotiations would start with countries such as the UK or Greenland and the Faroes, which would be included on behalf of the Danish application. So was this a lost cause from the outset? And the second question is the struggle for self-determination, which was connected with EU membership. How could this work? How can you get more control over your own political affairs while at the same time joining the European Union, which is based around the concept of transferring sovereignty? Today there might be different opinions about this, but at the time it was considered at least difficult. So, and these are the two dynamics I think are behind all of the debate in the 70s, and this is what I'm going to go into. I'm going to go into how they interplayed with each other and what was exactly the reason. Was it more economically motivated or was it more a political decision that Greenland did in the 70s and 80s by going outside? And as the political debate focused a lot on fisheries, I'm going to also start with fisheries. It was such an important thing, so we should start with that. This is a cartoon from a from the most important German political newspaper, magazine, Der Spiegel, which has a more like outside view of what Greenland did in '82. And my hypothesis is, well, economically motivated, it meant that fisheries interests kept Greenland outside in the end. This is the hypothesis I put forward here at the beginning. If you look at this, this is a more recent one. This is not 70s or 80s, but this has not changed so much, at least in the relative importance of fisheries for the societies in the North Atlantic. You can see how important fish and fisheries exports are for Iceland, especially Greenland and the Faroe Islands. I mean, these are the 14 largest fish catching nations in the world. And you have Norway on top, no, I think it's Europe, and you have Norway on top, but by far relatively less important fisheries, but still, it's 6%, is quite a lot. And then you have already Iceland on number 2 with a huge catch and also the huge importance for the economy. The Faroe Islands and even Greenland makes it to the list of the 14 European nations who catch the most fish. And relatively seen, you see in Greenland 87% dependency on fish exports in 2010, I think it was. And there's a strong correlation if you look at these numbers and if you look at who is in the EU and who isn't. I mean, Norway isn't, Iceland isn't, the Faroe Islands and Greenland aren't. And also there was a lot of opposition to fisheries policy in the UK by the fishermen in Scotland especially, but of course fisheries did not play such a big role in the UK overall, the same in Denmark. So at least there must be some correlation between fisheries policy and EU membership choice. And this correlation you can see on the left-hand side. I put what happened at the beginning of the 70s with regard to EU membership. And on the right hand I put what happened with regard to the fishing limit extensions. EU membership at the time, I jumped into it at the beginning, was completely opposed to the trend of extending fishing limits. You see in 58, 59, 61 and 63, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Norway and Greenland had all extended their fishing limits to 12 miles. Before it was like 3 to 4 miles. And you had, there were some exceptions still for some countries, but the direction was going, we need, the fishing industry was growing, fisheries was the backbone of the economy here, also in the other North Atlantic nations. We need to have the control over our fisheries resources because what shall we live off if not fisheries? And at the same time you have the EU founding states with small coastlines but large distant water fishing fleets. They need access. They need to get access to other seas in order for their fisheries to be able to catch fish because they have not such big fishing grounds. So you have these completely contradictory divisions at the beginning of 1970, and EC membership applications happen, as I said, 1 week after the EC members decide on this new fisheries policy. And of course, this would not work, and there were a lot of negotiations about exactly this. And in the accession treaties, they allowed at least to have a temporary 12-mile limit. But this was not okay for the Faroe Islands. They already said in 71, we're going to have a consideration time and let's see what the others are going to do. And 74, they decided to remain outside. This was not okay for Greenland. They demanded a 50-mile limit in 71. Didn't get it. And even the temporary limit of 12 miles, it was not clear whether it was 10 years temporary. It was not clear whether it would be extended. And in Norway, what is also interesting, if you see what happened in September 72, Iceland unilaterally extends its fishing limit to 50 miles, and only 1 month later you have the rejection in the Greenlandic referendum and in the Norwegian referendum. Of course, in Norway, fisheries was not as important, but still, it was a factor in the debate. And in the end, you have the Faroe Islands, Norway, and remaining outside. You have Iceland remaining outside from the beginning. They didn't even bother joining. And in 1977, everything comes as the international trend towards the extension of fishing limits was. In the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, the 200-mile fishing limit becomes the regular norm, and everybody extends to 200 miles. So Faroe Islands exclusive fishing limit, can fish all the fish until 200 miles. The same holds true for Canada, for the US, for everybody, but except for Greenland, because Greenland is now part of the community seas. The waters around Greenland, 200 miles, they could have, but they don't, because it's community seas. So this is also taken, I think, from a 72 referendum, this cartoon. This is basically how the feeling was, because everybody else, Norway could now fish up until 200 miles, only their own fishermen. Greenland couldn't. And the feeling, and that's also why the feeling in the 70s, if you look at the debate, it was in the emerging CO movement, you see a lot of talk about we need to get a real fisheries limit. Even in Attersuttel, Lars Chemnitz, he was Landsråd foreman until, I think, 78, until Home Rule started. And he went on all the negotiations saying, if we don't change this, we're not going to win the people for EU membership. I mean, there has to be some change. And he was saying that, and he wanted to remain inside of the EU. And so you have this debate, and the EU reacts to this. I mean, we heard it before. Paul Delster, the EU Commission, he was here, I think, in 76, 77. Once you're here, you get to know the peculiar Greenlandic conditions. I mean, they cannot leave you unimpressed. And there was something that called the Hague preferences at the time, which basically meant that Greenland would be prioritized with a catch in the negotiations in Brussels. It also meant that the EU, of course, would come next and would divide the rest. But everything Greenland could catch, they should catch. That was the principle behind it. So the EU did somehow address the Greenlandic concerns. And if you look at the fish catches in West Greenlandic waters from 72 until 1980, you actually see that the catch is increasing in Greenland. So the development of the Greenlandic fishing industry is taken into account. But the problem, and relatively also, you see that the other states in West Greenlandic waters get less and less quota. I mean, it's not always like a regular development, but there is a development. So you can argue that the European communities at the time, they tried to take Greenlandic fishers' interests into account. But there are two problems. 77, I mentioned the extension of the fishing into 200 miles. This meant that German fishermen, they were thrown out of all waters, like Canada, US, where they used to fish. So they needed to get their fish elsewhere. And with the growing possibility of Greenlandic fishermen to catch the fish in their waters, also their capacity was increasing. So where should German fishermen go to fish? Where should the French go to fish if they are all excluded from the coastlines? And that was the problem, because so even if you had the Hague preferences, you had a problem because the fish didn't just increase. I mean, if it would have been more for everybody, maybe it would have been fine. So what happened then is that some countries or some fishermen decided to catch more than they actually were allowed to by the European Commission. And this was especially true for West Germany, which were caught red-handed fishing caught. I think 79, it was 12 ships, and 1980, 3 ships were actually boarded by the Danish Coastal Guard, and they were charged with fishing above their limits. And I mean, this was, of course, created a problem in Greenland, that the mood towards the EU didn't get better. I mean, even if you had Hague preferences, you could have thought, yeah, maybe we take into account, but then you have something like this. And of course, people coming here fishing more fish than they may, this is what the EU stood a little bit in Greenland. That was part of the problem. But having said that, I'm not going to argue that economy is actually the most important thing to consider in the 70s. Despite all the importance of fisheries, I would argue that it was not the economy. And there are some reasons for this, which I want to go into now a little bit. And first of all, we heard this a little bit before. I mean, the EU came in with a big offer. You see constantly increasing payments and subsidies for Greenlandic villages and towns. I mean, this is a lot of money. And it kept rising. We don't know how it would have continued. but you have money from the European Social Fund, from the European Regional Development Fund, Agricultural Guidance and Guarantee Fund. So you have the grants increasing, and you also have, in addition, credits from the European Investment Bank, which went to Greenland in the 70s, and which provided a very good foundation for Atassut to claim, when we go out, we're going to be worse off economically. And it made it very hard for Siumut to actually constate, well, if we have all the fish for ourselves, we will actually be better off, and some things will become cheaper, as we heard before. So this was kind of the debate. I think Siumut had a hard time arguing that the economy is actually going to be better. In the end, maybe they were right, but they had a hard time in the 70s. And also the fisheries inspections, for example, they were financed by the EU. So only because of fisheries inspections, the Greenland authorities could actually catch West Germans fishing unlawfully in Greenlandic waters. So this is something that cannot be forgotten. If you don't have inspections, of course, everybody can fish and you cannot control your own territory. So this is something you have to keep in mind. And in addition, first this was from a brochure that the European communities did in the 70s to inform, I put it in brackets, about the benefits of EU membership. And of course, this looks kind of amazing. I mean, nearly every village, well, every village on this, it's a lot of villages, and they got money from the EU, some project from the European Social Fund or the European Regional Development Fund. So there was a lot of money flowing into Greenland. And what I want to say now is, having a look at this, the question, how much worth is reserving the catch for oneself if you cannot sell the fish you catch? The question was less relevant in the 70s, I think. But if you look at the Faroe Islands and the debate they have today, they don't have custom-free access to the EU market. So they have exactly this question. What do you want to do? How do you want your economy to be organized? Do you want to catch your own fish within 200 miles, raw fish, and then sell it to the EU market? Or do you want to catch fish from elsewhere, produce it in Greenland in factories on site, and then sell it to the market and get much better prices? This is a debate coming in the 90s especially, but I want to raise this question anyway, because I think it's not so easy. We have to have control of our fish. This is good for the economy. Not necessarily. I mean, there are other ways. The Spanish today, they fish in front of Morocco and get the fish home and get it produced. So, I mean, I'm not saying that Greenland should do this, but this is a question you have to consider. It's not just about access to the fish, it's about selling access to the market. And you see already in the 70s, Greenland had a lot of exports were going to the EC. If you include Denmark and EFTA, because the EFTA states had bilateral agreements with the EC, it meant that 85% of exports were going to EU territory. And it was not clear whether Greenland would be granted custom-free access. I mean, in the end they did, but it was not clear in the 70s and ended up coming to the referendum. So now this is the outside view. There was a report done by the European Parliament, Directorate General for Research and Innovation, which made it very clear how they saw the situation in Greenland at that time. I think it was 81, 82. And they state that clearly that Greenland has economically a lot to lose, and a little or maybe nothing to gain from leaving the EC. And this is quite a statement. I mean, usually it's more like balanced. You say, yeah, there's some things you lose, some things to win. But they couldn't really see why Greenland should do this from an economic point of view. And another article in this, I mentioned the German magazine Der Spiegel, also plastic, where they called it pure Dummheit, which means like pure stupidity. That's what they thought this decision was from an economic point of view, political, let's say. So I doubted very much that actually before the 1982 referendum, it was an economic motivation that made the Siumut government, which came to power in 1979, decide about leaving the European communities. And they actually stated it in Parliament. I found this quote from Jonathan Motzfeldt in 81, I think, in the parliamentary documentation. And it's not himself saying that it is a protocol, so you don't know how it sounded in real. But if you believe this, he said that it would, with a question if it would be better, purely economically, to be inside the EC, he said yes. But from a political evaluation, it would not be. Because you need the competence to govern the country yourselves, and this is important. So there was economic win to be a member, but from a political standpoint, it's not right. And I think this is important too, because this is before the referendum. This is before there was a Greenland Treaty and all the good things that came with it. People didn't know beginning of the 80s. So the motivation, I think, was not economic. And sometimes it's portrayed as being like that. I think from the retrospective, of course, everything was right. You've got the Greenland Treaty, it was such a good thing. The EU kept paying money for fish that wasn't even longer there, that they were not catching anymore. It was a lot of money the EU was paying. It was more than the subsidies Greenland got before 82. So actually, when you look at it from a retrospective, yes, it was such an economically sensible move. But at the time, people didn't know. And Lars Emil Johansen, I quote this here because we have such a good agreement with the EU. It's always the argument killing all EU debates in Greenland, that the treaty is so good, why should we talk about it? I mean, they're still paying for us. They consider us geostrategically so important that they're going to keep paying. They're not only going to pay for fish, they kept for fish that wasn't even there. Now they're paying for education because they want to get the foot in the door maybe, or whatever the reason the EU member states might have. But of course, it was not, they didn't know that it would come like that. So I think you should look at the other hypothesis, that the EC membership question was inextricably connected with the question of Greenland's self-determination, and it was perceived as contradictory to it. And you have this quote from a book that came out in '83, in which Moses Olsen is quoted and stating that it was exactly the right to determine by ourselves whether to become a member of the community or not, which triggered the request for home rule, and then in consequence of which we decided to leave the community. And coming back to what we have heard about this, 71 was the turning point. Because you have all these Landsråd chairmen supporting EC membership on the basis of, well, we consult the Danish government, they know what is good for us, so they're going to take our interests into account, but not seeing a role for Greenlandic politics beyond that. And this is what changed in '71. We heard when Moses Olsen was elected to the Folketing, when Lars Emil Johansen and Jonathan Motzfeldt joined the Landsråd, young politicians with different views. And the different views came into expression, for example, when Moses Olsen talked in the Folketing. This is the identity discourse that came. We are Greenlanders, we can be proud of it. We are not like Copenhagen. They cannot treat us as if we are part of the Danish kingdom, even if we are a part still. But they cannot treat us that way. It's not possible anymore. And this view was not there with maybe the older people in the Landsråd. They had a different grown-up situation. They had been, how do you call this, socialized differently. And this is what I think is very important. This is why it's such an important year. And we have more in common with Denmark, with Norway, Faroe Islands and Iceland than with Denmark. So even if legally seen, maybe we don't have a choice in '72, we should have a choice. And this is what brought the whole home rule process into being, I think. That's why this year you cannot be understated how important that was. And I think it's also interesting if you look at the two referenda from the position of Denmark, good cop or bad cop. The '72 decision was clearly motivated by the resistance against Denmark. There was not so much substance matter that was discussed. Of course, already at this stage, fisheries was becoming a problem. We need our fishing limit, as I said before. This was an important discussion, but the actual questions were discussed. Why didn't we get a consideration time like the Faroes did? Why didn't we get a separate referendum if we are different from Denmark? You cannot treat us this way. These were the questions discussed in '72, and not whether fisheries interests are better off inside the EU or outside. That's why I think this is so important. And you see that the remedy against Danish rule will be increased self-determination. But this, of course, meant at the same time you cannot go into the European communities, because then you lose, the sovereignty moves from Copenhagen to Brussels instead going from Copenhagen to Nuuk. This was basically the main argument. And I believe, at least how I read it, the '82 referendum, the dissatisfaction was no longer with Denmark, only indirectly. Well, we have seen Danish rule, it has not brought us many benefits or less benefits. So I think, at least my interpretation is that Denmark was perceived rather as an ally helping Greenland than an enemy within the EC. But this is open for interpretation, if that's true. So yes, a lost cause for the EC, yes, because from the outset, from 71, 72, Danish rule was equalized with the rule of the European communities. There was no way of a discourse saying that we have in Scotland today, that actually you win something, you want out of the UK, but in the EU. Such a discourse was not possible because of the combination of the two questions from the outset. Danish rule is the same as EC rule. And it was the argument was, as Jonathan Motzfeldt put it just before the referendum, if you have voted for home rule, you also have to say no to membership in the EC. It's basically the same thing. If you want to govern yourself, you have to go out. Doesn't matter if it's Danish rule or EC rule. It was considered in the same box. So it was very hard to argue against this kind of discourse. Now we have attempts, I think in the 2000s, the Diplomater here, they try to put it differently, this question a little bit, and say, well, maybe we win something, maybe sovereignty is an old concept, it should not be understood as being in control of affairs, but there are problems which are bigger than you can solve at home, and so on. But at the time, this discourse does not exist. So yeah, this brings it to the point, I think home rule is a process directed towards political independence. EC cooperation is a process directed towards integration and well, becoming together of the member states, and this cannot be united. That was the view, and we have our decision in Greenland will be we want home rule instead for EC assimilation, as Lars Emil called it. Also, an argument which you can see why I think this political explanation makes more sense is if you look at how Atassut campaigned in the 82 referendum. It's very interesting to see the newspaper articles until the end of 71. Lars Chemnitz was on TV and was asked, yeah, why do you want to remain inside the EC? And he said, well, you know, it's the grants. We get so much money. And he was campaigning on this. And yeah, the store EF-tilskud, de var baggrunden for. And later, and you see it, it's not only this quote, but you see it in January and February, he was getting a feeling that this argument might not win the debate in Greenland. The economy didn't bring him any further. So what did he do? He brought the old argument, but this is going to threaten the union, the rigsfællesskab. This is why we need to be inside. So I think that the changing of course of Atassut, and it was also Otto Stenholt, I think he was called, before the referendum, I think this changing of course showed that he actually realized, I'm not going to win this with economic arguments, I have to use political arguments. And yeah, last to this point, I believe that the fisheries issue, although fisheries of course are economically important, was more a political question. The question was a question if I have to go to Brussels to negotiate about my own fish swimming here next in Nuuk Harbor. I think this question was much more important than the question of if it was an economic decision. I think economically you can argue in both ways. But from a political standpoint, you want to be in control of your fish because it's so important for your country, it's so important for your exports. You want to be in control, but not from economic reasons, also for economic, but I think more for political reasons. And I found two quotes confirming this view. Well, Moses Olsen said, home rule wouldn't be worth much if it lacked the power to master your fishery. Yes, if your fishery makes up 90% of exports, makes kind of sense. And in the Siumut Party paper in '79, it was clearly said from Siumut that we have nothing against sharing our fisheries resources. That's not the problem here. The problem is that they presume to decide about the fish in our waters. And we don't want that. We're going to give them something, and they did in the Greenland Treaty. But it's on our conditions and not on theirs. So this is political, this is not economic. And also, Jonathan Motzfeldt mentioned this in '81, that the difference between what is a right and what is a possibility. It should not be a right for the EU to fish in Greenlandic waters because you are in the EU. It should be a possibility that Greenland offers, or it doesn't offer, but it's up to the sovereign decision of Greenland to decide. And he also said, yeah, you fishermen, they can fish here, and we will make an agreement, but it will be on our conditions and not on yours. And this is exactly what the withdrawal from EU membership is about, he said. So that's why I believe. And there are some more instances where you can feel that it was a political thing about fisheries. For example, in I think 1980 or 1981, the West Germany got a quota for, what was it, cod or shrimps in East Greenland. And Greenlandic fishermen didn't even fish there at the time, but they were still complaining, how can they do this? But I mean, the fish was there, it could have been caught or not, but from a political standpoint, this was not okay. The same that the EU always tried to balance, if Greenland got more fish, Denmark got less. I mean, there were attempts like this. So there also was like, you cannot treat us the same way, we're not the same state. Well, we don't feel being the same anymore. Or when Norway got access, I think it was salmon, also in East Greenlandic waters, Norway got access to this. And in return, the EC fishermen got access to Norway. So Greenland was like a playing ball for the EU, and this is what went against you. I want to have the political control. I want to be treated like that. And nearly the Greenland Treaty even was failing in the end, I think, 83, because of the question whether the EC would keep the quota on Norwegian and Faroese fisheries in Greenlandic waters. This was like a minor point, I would say, but it was a big point because no, it's our right to decide about what Norway and Faroese fishermen may fish in our territory. It's not up to the EU to continue to decide this once we are outside. So these are like small instances. And of course, also we had it before the seal skin debate, and there was a fear that the whole debate might move away from fish to whales and to seals. So in the end, you would not only go to Brussels to negotiate about your own fish, but also to negotiate about your own seals and your own whales. And this was something, no, we cannot do this. And it doesn't matter if it's economically sensible or not. So summing up, I believe, and for discussion, we can discuss this, but I believe from what I read is that it was motivated by the struggle for self-determination. And that the dissatisfaction with Danish rule transposed itself on the EC, so it was contradictory from the outset. And I believe that the control of fisheries was bound to self-determination. It was deciding about the catch oneself. It was rather a political than an economic necessity. Economically, you could have solved it the other way, but from a political standpoint, this was the way it should be done. So thank you for having me here. It's great to be back, and I look forward to the discussions. And I would really have liked to be here the next day, because now I'm actually working for the German Research Foundation, a lot with cooperation with Western and Northern Europe in forskningsområdet, and would have been great to be there for the discussions tomorrow. But you can always get into contact with me in my new job. I could theoretically also deal with Greenland. Thank you.